The Summer I Turned Pretty isn't a show with traditional villains. While, yeah, there are certainly characters that people tend to root for and others who seem to get booed every time they're on screen, the show strongly features people who are just trying to navigate the events of the story to the best of their ability. But what if I told you that there's one character that actually kind of ends up being the catalyst for a lot of the problems on the show? And that character is one that many don't actually end up expecting. And that character is Susannah Beck Fisher. While she's only been present in Season 1 and all of her other appearances are through flashbacks, Susannah's influence is one of the biggest driving factors of the show, while also being so subtle that it's easy to miss. In a way, Susannah has negatively affected the people she loved most, even after her passing. But before I can get into that, I'll need to talk about spoilers, so please be informed that I will be talking about the following for the purposes of this video. And with that, let's actually get to know who Susannah is. So, Susannah Beck Fisher is the mother to Conrad and Jeremiah, wife to Adam, best friend to Laurel, and functionally an aunt to Stephen and Belly. And while she's warm, caring, and a beloved member of the family, she does have a major character flaw. She's very particular about her ideal life and wants everything to play out the way she envisions it. She's a bit of a perfectionist, preferring to hide the flaws and the ugly aspects of her life, and preferring to maintain the illusion of having achieved perfection, even if it's not necessarily in line with what other people want for themselves. Susannah is an assertive character, but you almost don't see it because it's so well hidden behind her mask of being the picturesque American mother. But she's not a villain in the traditional sense. None of the characters are. She's just a character who wanted an image of a perfect life and pushed that idea onto others. It came with good intentions, but unfortunately this flaw of hers did negatively affect those closest to her, while also being a catalyst for some of the biggest conflicts on the show. And let's jump into each one of them, shall we? First of all, there's the case of her cancer. Susannah having cancer and her impending passing are a major plot point in Season 1. The thing is, she understands that she's not long for this world, and yet she decides to keep it a secret and hold it close to herself. And the reason she does this is because she wants one last perfect summer in Cousins before she passes on. Now, I've never been in a situation where I was dying, but if I did have a hypothetical timer on my life, I would think that it's best to inform my loved ones because I want them to mentally prepare themselves for when it happens. And I would assume that that's the norm. But Susannah explicitly doesn't want her family to know about it. She keeps it from everyone because she wants one last perfect summer, and she doesn't want it to be all about her. And while I can respect that, I cannot deny that her hiding the truth about her declining health only made things worse. Her boys, who both loved her very much, likely didn't know how to process the death of a loved one. And because she hid everything, Jeremiah found out at one of the worst times possible, during the Deb Ball, and that ended up causing a scene at a very high-profile event. In her pursuit of perfection, her one last perfect summer was bookended with a fight between her loving sons. With her idealism in mind, it's also in character for her to initially reject the treatment that could potentially save her life, because in her words, she wants to be herself when she goes. She'd rather die a perfect woman than risk chemotherapy changing her. She has to be convinced by her sons before she goes through potentially life-saving care. But that's not entirely on her, because I do want to point out that she did do chemotherapy before, but while she was on chemo, her husband Adam cheated on her, which is a horrible thing to do, and probably might have added to Susannah's trauma of chemotherapy. Now, while we're here, let's talk a bit about Adam too. Infidelity is a horrible thing, and it's perfectly valid for Susannah not to want Adam around after he cheated on her. But how she handled the optics of it is yet another example of how Susannah as a character focuses too much on having that perfect appearance. In Season 1, Episode 4, we saw that even though Adam cheated on her years ago, she never told anyone about this fact. And it's perfectly valid to not want to be around the person who cheated on her, but rather interestingly, she also doesn't tell anybody, not Jeremiah, not Conrad, and not even Laurel until she drags it out of her. Now, Conrad has the sense to figure out the situation for himself, and as a result puts some distance between him and his father, but Jeremiah has no idea what happened. For much of the show, he's still under the illusion that the Fishers are a perfect family and that Dad's just busy providing for them, which is why he isn't around as much anymore. And while it may have seemed like a selfless act to protect her sons from having a broken family, we also see that it caused long-term long-term damage to both Jeremiah and Conrad. By not addressing the elephant in the room and avoiding confrontation, she seeded problems in her sons that would only bear fruit as they grew older. Jeremiah grew up thinking that sweeping things under the rug would be just as good as solving them, which led to him never telling Belly about the events of Cabo before it was too late. Meanwhile, Conrad, who knew about the cheating, learned to bottle up his feelings and lie to the people around him to keep up appearances and avoid conflict, like when he lies to everyone about not having feelings for Belly, even to his own therapist. We see the toxic patterns of the parent repeat themselves in her children, and how Susannah's conflict avoidance has manifested in her kids in their own negative ways. And they have to unlearn those habits for them to move on with their lives and go back to being normal siblings. And speaking of siblings, let's talk about Aunt Julia. The conflict between Susannah and her half-sister was the driving force behind the events of Season 2. Aunt Julia wanted to sell the beach house not because of money, but because of her own personal vendetta against Susannah. Growing up, Susannah and Julia did actually have a relationship, but Julia never felt welcomed at the cousin's house. To the Becks, Julia was just an outsider, especially to Susannah's mother. The cousin's house was Susannah's home, not Julia's, even if the legal papers say it was both of theirs to share. But the real rift in their relationship was caused by the shitmus incident, where Julia told Susannah about her mother mistreating her, but Susannah just brushed it aside and invalidated her experiences and feelings, and just because of that, they practically cut all contact. Instead of trying to fix things, Susannah never reached out. Only when she was on the brink of death did she send a letter. She died not knowing if her half-sister still hated her or not. Susannah never properly addresses the situation with Aunt Julia and leaves Laurel and the kids to deal with the fallout. This is yet another example of how her keeping things prim, pretty, and perfect and avoiding things that are ugly, like conflict, just making things worse. She practically exiled her half-sister and her child, and her sons grew up barely knowing them. Instead of swallowing her pride and properly addressing the rift between them, she focused on keeping up that image of perfection. It's heartbreaking because she chose something so arbitrary over her own sister. And we see this conflict between siblings being seeded into the next generation, in her sons Conrad and Jeremiah. First of all, Susannah had a clear favoritism towards Conrad. She boasts about his achievements as an athlete, a sailor, and a student. Whether she realizes it or not, Susannah depends on Conrad to fix situations. She sees her older son as the dependable one. When Belly needed a date to the dead ball, she asked Conrad to do it instead of Jeremiah, despite both of her sons having a reason to not want to participate. This blatant favoritism has definitely affected Jeremiah throughout the series, as we've seen him belittle himself for not being as capable as his older brother. But it also negatively affected Conrad in a way, because he grows up believing that he, and only he, has to be able to fix things to protect Jeremiah and the Conklins. We clearly see this manifest in Season 2 when he tries to address Aunt Julia's sale of the beach house on his own, without contacting Jeremiah, Belly, or even Laurel. Something like that is simply too much for a college kid to handle, especially alone. But given how he was raised, we can see why he tried to do this. And on the other hand, when it comes to Jeremiah, it's like she never pushed him to be any better. She viewed him as perfect for who he is and didn't want him to change. And while that is beautiful, we also see how little Jeremiah grows as the years go by because he isn't pressured to change. In Season 3, we see how immature he is about serious situations like choosing a home, finding a career, and the significance of marriage. By raising her children so differently, she unknowingly seeded a sibling rivalry between them, where everyone looks at Conrad as the responsible one, while Jeremiah is Jeremiah. And moving on, I've already talked about Laurel and Susannah's relationship at length in my previous video, so go watch that if you haven't already. But the gist is that Laurel and Susannah were so close that they were seemingly codependent on each other, relying on each other so much that it was damaging to their other relationships. They had a beautiful relationship as kindred spirits, but I want to focus more on Susannah's influence on Laurel's daughter, Belly. See, Belly is the main character of the entire show, and one of the core themes of the show is her finding her identity. Much of the story is about Belly going through life as she finds out who she wants to be. And while Laurel raises Belly to become her own person and to emphasize individuality, Susannah does the opposite, influencing Belly to try to become more like her, or rather, an ideal version of her. For example, in the show, Susannah pushes Belly to join the dev ball, insists that it's something that she simply has to experience, despite the fact that we have no indication that other women like Laurel or Taylor have gone through the experience as well. In fact, the dev ball is only a cousin's event. The other characters not named Susannah even try to discourage Belly from committing to it, claiming that it simply isn't her. We also see her push her idea of femininity onto Belly, as we can see when they go dress shopping. Susannah pushes Belly to go all out with her dress, but when Laurel suggests to buy something more simple, a dress that Belly absolutely adores, Susannah somewhat aggressively rejects it despite Belly's own feelings. It's a very subtle interaction, but with everything else that we know of Susannah's character, it goes very much in line with her as she pushes her idea of perfection onto other people, putting her feelings before theirs. And I think it's kind of why Susannah grooms Belly, but not in the creepy age gap relationship sense of the word. Susannah grooms Belly in the sense that she's preparing her for a role, and that is to inevitably end up with one of her two boys. Susannah has repeatedly claimed that she believes that Belly is destined for either Jeremiah or Conrad, even to Belly herself, and that's partly the reason why she's so intertwined with them. And it's also probably the reason, up to this point in the story, she's been so focused on them as romantic partners. Susannah definitely played a role in Belly believing that she's destined for either Jeremiah or Conrad, and why she can't just get off the crazy roller coaster that is their love triangle. Instead of letting Belly experience love for herself in an organic, natural way, she subtly nudged her to her sons, and when you think about it that way, it's kind of creepy. Even if she has such little on-screen presence in season 3, her influence on Belly is undeniable, especially in episode 9. In this episode, Belly goes all the way to Paris after fleeing her wedding, and for much of it, she's chasing her backpack after some thief took it while she wasn't looking. And while a lot of people have criticized this scene, there is some narrative significance to this. See, the reason why she wants her backpack back so badly is because earlier in the episode, while she was on the plane to Paris, she puts her engagement ring in her backpack. And that ring represents everything that Susannah wanted. Belly marrying one of her boys and living her happily ever after in Cousins. And a lot of people have been saying that this is a metaphor, and that's right. Because Belly running around Paris trying to get her ring back is actually a metaphor for the entire show up until this point. Think about it. Belly has ignored many different aspects of her life because she thought that she was destined to be Belly Fisher and live in the beach house, but really, that's a wish that Susannah pushed onto her. For much of the show, Belly has just been chasing what Susannah would have wanted. She juggles falling in love with either of her sons. She becomes a debutante. She indirectly saves Susannah's magical cousin's house, and she almost ends up marrying one of her kids. For much of this show, Belly has just been chasing what Susannah would have wanted. And when she finally gets to Paris, we see that she's still doing it. She was in one of the most breathtaking cities in the world, a place where she's always wanted to go on a beautiful day, and all she could think about was getting the ring back and going home. But when Belly finally reclaims her backpack, she does it in a violent way, something that Susannah probably never would have approved of. Her reclaiming her backpack in such a way is kind of like Belly reclaiming her identity, not just from the thief, but from Susannah. Because Susannah is the one who really pushed this idea onto Belly of marrying into her family and inheriting her magical beach house, but by choosing to stay in Paris, to fall in love with someone who isn't related to the Fishers, and her becoming Isabel Conklin instead of becoming Belly Fisher, is a direct rejection of everything that Susannah would have wanted. And I think Belly is all the better for it.